Good evening. We begin tonight with new details on issues with a downtown Minot apartment. Residents having to abruptly leave the building today after inspectors say they found some structural damage inside. Now it's led to area road closures too. Fire crews responding to a report of a fire alarm and visible structural damage this afternoon at the Artspace Lofts apartment. Now, there was no fire, but the city says inspectors found cracks in the floor, ceiling, and walls of a unit. The management company is relocating all residents tonight in an abundance of caution. Meanwhile, the city has closed off half a block of Main Street South and Central Avenue East, including their respective sidewalks. The duration of the closures will depend on how quickly a structural engineer can perform an inspection and the results of the inspection. The 34-unit complex opened in 2013. We'll have updates for you tomorrow as we get them.